I think we need to be extremely careful in all situations that what we're doing is not so much about our own desires and what we want, that we lose sight of very important considerations, including the good of the individual and justice, what's owed to the individual we're talking about here.
Welcome to the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm Dr. Brett Sockel. This podcast and community are all about equipping Catholic educators like you to approach every subject area and your entire vocation as a teacher through the lens of our Catholic faith. Each month, I sit down with inspiring guests, and together we'll explore how every classroom can become a place of faith, truth, and beauty. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you know a fellow Catholic teacher, share this podcast with them. Let's build this community together. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brett Sockel, and I'm delighted today to be joined by an old or of long acquaintance, I've heard used, a friend and colleague of long acquaintance, Charlie Camosy. If people have listened to my other podcast, Thinking Faith, Charlie has been a guest there a couple times. He's been up here to visit us in Regina, and I've met with him in New Jersey, and he's just someone I admire and whose insight I always look for. So I'm delighted to have you here with us today, Charlie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. In between my master's and PhD, I spent 3 years teaching high school, and so I've thought a lot about how this matters. I'm even finishing up, or should be published in the fall, a new moral theology textbook for high school students. And so I'm just, even though I'm professor and, until recently taught at a medical school, going back to undergrad at CUA now, I have a really deep soft spot in my heart for thinking about a lot of these audiences. So.
Excellent. Well, it makes you really well qualified to speak into this space. Your theological education, your work, particularly in healthcare and bioethics, and then your background in high school teaching. Tell us a little bit about you do so much work across such a range of things, but tell us a little bit about your work, particularly in terms of healthcare.
Well, I guess it probably started when I started my doctoral work at Notre Dame in bioethics and moral theology. I thought a lot about what even healthcare is. And I know we'll be talking a lot about that today, but not just in the abstract. So I did my dissertation on how Catholic social teaching should or could inform clinical decision-making in the neonatal intensive care unit. And so trying to marry Catholic social teaching with bioethics in a way that mattered to clinicians. I rounded with clinicians, NICUs, 3 of them in the United States and a couple overseas, as part of my research. And so even as a graduate student, I was really interested in making sure that the theology and bioethics I was doing was deeply relevant to how this actually worked, as the kids say, IRL. Do they still say IRL in real life?
Probably.
I'm getting old now. I just turned 50, so I'm probably out of touch there. But and then when I spent 14 years at Fordham University writing books related to these topics and try to refine some of this. But it was generally taking the same kind of approach, which is why I think Creighton School of Medicine came calling and asked if I would consider working for them, which I did the last 3 years, teaching bioethics to medical students. And so I've tried very hard during that time to learn more about how medical schools work compared to arts and letters schools or liberal arts schools. And it's quite different, actually, quite different. But during the time, both at Creighton and at Fordham, I've come to actually fall in love with nursing as a deep and profound way that a Catholic vision of healthcare gets played out in real life again. Whole person care, care of the patient in front of you. In some ways very resistant to the structures and systems that Catholic social teaching warns us about the sinful social structures and systems that push us away from true care for the whole person, as opposed to, making money for shareholders. And so I'm delighted that I'll be. I'm grateful for my time at Creighton, but I'm delighted to be moving to Catholic U in the fall, where I'll be teaching a lot of future nurses in a nursing school that self-consciously takes its identity, Catholic identity, very seriously, and a particular Catholic view of health very seriously.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to circle back near the end of the interview to some of the ways that the way we think about health is actually interdisciplinary. Very often when we talk Catholic social teaching, we think about social studies and history class. I don't think there's a lot of thinking that we do about Catholic social teaching in the way we teach health class, at least in my experience. So we'll certainly circle back to that. One of the themes that shows up when we try to make every class Catholic is that the boundaries between the disciplines start to break down. It becomes very obvious that when you stop just asking factual questions or skill-based questions or how does this work kind of questions, and you start asking like, what does this mean and what should I do kind of questions, which are really keys for thinking from a Catholic point of view, then all of a sudden the connections between disciplines start to jump out at you. So it's really interesting that you're already doing that kind of interdisciplinary stuff. So we'll certainly circle back around to that. I want to start though with something that actually jump-started our conversation here, which is a review you wrote of a book with a title that fascinated me. So the book is called A Theology of Health by a Harvard I don't know what to call him, a professor. I was going to say, I don't know, is he an ethicist? Is he a theologian? Is he a Harvard professor? And you can tell us more about him, Tyler Vanderweel. So you wrote a review of this book, A Theology of Health, and it got my attention because part of my conviction here is there's a theology of everything, whether you've thought about it or not. You have some set of presuppositions about the world and the human person and God or not God, but you're not neutral on it, and it impacts the way that you think about whatever it is that you're thinking about. And so I was super excited to see the name of this book, and then I was super excited to see that you had written a review of it. Tell us a little bit about Tyler Vanderweel's work, A Theology of Health, and what this might mean for how we start thinking about this as we move towards, thinking about secondary education, for example.
So Tyler Vanderweel is, I think, he's certainly educated in Britain. I'm pretty sure he's British. He did, I think it was either Oxford or Cambridge. Can't remember. I think it might have been Cambridge. He did his undergraduate work in theology and philosophy, and so has that background. But then turned to epidemiology and biostatistics for his doctoral work, and he's a professor of epidemiology and biostatistics at Harvard. And he spent a lot of time before writing this book on A Theology of Health focused on happiness studies and how health and flourishing and wholeness, he likes this word wholeness, contributes to happiness. And he's better known for that work and has quite a reputation actually in the secular worlds for doing that. It'd be, as I wrote in the review, his colleagues must be stunned to have seen a book come out with a major university press like Notre Dame on the theology of health, because it really outs him as a deeply, profoundly theological person who understands that health and wholeness are deeply connected to a vision of the good, a concern for ultimate matters. And he doesn't refer to just those kind of, least common denominator terms. He's a Catholic and he talks about suffering. He talks about sin. He talks about the afterlife. He's unabashedly theological in his book, A Theology of Health, which you can't always say about every theology book written today, as you know. But the context in which he's discussing this is so interesting because there's a huge debate, as you may know, about what even health is. Like, how do you, and what health, based on one of his presuppositions in coming to the work is, we've talked a lot about health care without really understanding what even health is. And so, and I agree with that. In fact, as I was preparing for this podcast interview, Brett, I was thinking about the fact that as I move to CUA and sometime in the near future, I'll be teaching a doctoral seminar in bioethics there. I was actually thinking of starting with this book, A Theology of Health, and a few others as the opening sort of gambit of the semester. Like, how do we even think about health as a thing? And then just to show throughout the semester how where we come down on this fundamental question just impacts everything else that we're going to discuss. I will say, by means of finishing this overly long answer, not everyone agrees with Tyler Vanderweel. He has a very sort of expansive view that's theologically informed about what health is. And it includes the physical, the mental, the social, the spiritual. And he talks about, he defines health as wholeness intended by God. But there are other Christians, and certainly secular folks, but other Christians who take a different view about health. For instance, Farr Curlin and Christopher Tollefson wrote this book called The Way of Medicine, which came out just a few years ago. I think it's 2021, where they define health as the well-working of the human organism. They just want to limit it to a straight up no chaser sort of understanding of the health of the well-working of the organism. And so between, sort of Curlin and Tollefson and Vanderweel, there's a whole range of views about what even health is. If you can expand it to, wholeness as intended by God, which encompasses the physical, the mental, the social, and spiritual dimensions. Or you could have very other faithful Christians and Catholics say, no, we want to limit it to the well-working of the human organism. Yeah, quite a range of debate about what health even is in the first place.
Well, let me ask what Charlie Camosy's definition of what health is, and because I think I appreciate that you're willing to grant that there's lots of views, but maybe help us think through some of the categories you would use to judge between those views and what kind of considerations you think are important there, and then maybe relatedly, if I can follow up with this, because this is something that I try to help people think of in their work in Catholic schools, is what kind of a good is health?
Yeah.
Because it's one good among many, and you have to make decisions balancing goods in our life like all the time. So maybe the first question, what is health, is a good question to help us inform how we might answer the second question, what kind of a good is health, and how does it relate to other goods in this life?
Yeah. So I hopefully it's not a cop-out, Brett, to say my views on this question are in process, and I don't know that I have a sort of Camosy definition of health ready to give you. I actually thought about it because I thought you might ask me about this, and I thought, well, what am I going to say to him, because I don't really know what I think. I guess if I guess if I had to try to answer with the proviso that it's very much in process, and I reserve the right to change my mind about this, I'd want to try to split the difference between Curlin and Tollefson and Vanderweel. I'd want to say health and healthcare are about the well-working of the human organism, but with reference to the flourishing and wholeness intended by God, which would include a broader range of things, right? So what might this mean? So maybe imagine somebody who's coming to the end of their life due to cancer. And by the way, I'm coming to you live from my parents' basement where I'm staying with them for a while because my dad is struggling with cancer at the moment. And this question is very real for us right now. We don't know how long he's got. So it's, one of the things we're thinking about and he's thinking about is, what does a good life look like? If this is in fact the last few years or months that we have with him and he has with us. And, it's not really, there's a kind of choice that many people make out of wisdom and understanding of their finitude and the realities of the situation they're facing, where they say, well, I'm not really concerned with trying to have the human organism work as well as it could at this point, right? But rather I'm choosing some other good, right? I'm choosing to stay as pain-free as I can so that I can engage in as many meaningful conversations as I can for the time I have remaining, or to pray before bed so I'm not in racking pain, or any number of things that wouldn't be focused on the well-working of the human organism. In fact, you could argue that doing more chemotherapy or experimental treatments are the best ways to maximize the well working of the human organism over time, whereas palliative care limits the well working of the human organism over time in some ways, right? Because, as you may know, giving a certain amount of pain medication can inhibit respiration, have other impacts on the well working of the human organism, but it's pursued towards these other goods. So, so, so I think the way I'm trying to parse it is to say, health and healthcare are focused on these broader things that Vanderweel is and others are interested in, including the American Medical Association, which has a very broad understanding of what health is. No, it's the World Health Organization. I meant, sorry to say, has a broader understanding, very similar to Vanderweel's, without the God part and the divine part and the afterlife part and the teleology part. But I want to try to limit it in the way that Kurlan and Tollefson try to limit it. So even palliative care, though it's not aimed at maximizing life years or life weeks or life months, it is still focused on the well-working of the human organism in a way, right? Because it is good that you're able to pray or talk with friends and family, sleep uninterrupted throughout the night, right? These are still in some ways focused on the well-working of the human organism, but as a means of accomplishing these other things, right? So I don't know if this is too convoluted to make sense. As I mentioned, I'm still trying to work out some of this for myself. But I think there's insights from both that at least I want to try to. And then so to answer the question, what kind of good is health? I would say it's, and this is Vanderweel's point too, it's both an intrinsic good, to the extent that it's good that creatures flourish as the kinds of organisms God created them to be. That's just good, period. It's a basic good. But it's also an instrumental good for the reasons that I just said, right? It's also about something else at the same time. So much of what Catholicism is about is trying to negotiate these kind of either or dichotomous binaries that we're faced with. And I think we need to try to do that again here.
Right. An idea that emerged as you were talking through your in process thing is the distinction between the good of the body and the good of the person. It seems to me that one way of defining health is just a question about bodies, just physical organisms. And that's a very intelligible thing. You can make sense of that, right? And then you can say, but there seems to be something else going on with humans, at least, that they're not just bodies. They are persons who are body, soul composites, or however you want to put it. And that means that there are other considerations that get weighed in the balance with strict bodily health, right? Conversations, relationships, prayer, like a few of the things you mentioned are things that persons do more than they are things that bodies do. Persons do them with their bodies and through their bodies. And I'm just wondering if that image of the ensouled body that is a person is one way of thinking about these things, whereas another way of thinking about them is like, we're only talking about the physical organism at this point. And that is a certain kind of good, surely. But how does it relate to these other kinds of goods that are experienced by a person?
Yeah, I want to affirm that in the strongest possible terms. But as you're mentioning it, I just can't help but hear some, I don't know if critics is the right word, but contravailing views from those who want to say that, the living human body without the capacity for those relationships, for those interactions, is therefore not a person anymore, right? Which I would want to, and I think you and I would both want to reject that view. So, there's a person present who's, in the cases that I have in mind, like say, later stage dementia, even somebody in a coma, a very young human being prenatally, say, even a newborn infant, depending on how we define what we're talking about here in terms of relationships and communication. These are still human persons, ensouled bodies, but they don't have these kind of capacities either yet or because of some accident, right? Some accident of life, accident of age, but nothing about their intrinsic nature is at all different simply because they can't communicate, they can't pray. So I would want to hold that in the background of what you said as well, while agreeing with you.
Yeah, I would totally accept that that caveat. Yeah, very good. Well, let's. You wrote an article, or it's coming out soon, as I understand it, that also has a provocative title that's related to the kind of work we do here. I don't have the exact title in front of me, so I'll let you correct me. But it's something about why theology is queen of the medical humanities. And just to introduce that for our listeners, lots of us will be familiar, but some of us may not be, with this medieval structuring of the sort of orders of knowledge. And it was commonly said that theology is the queen of the sciences, which now to some people, that sounds almost dangerous, because science needs its kind of independence, which is true. Like, Catholics don't deny the rightful methodological independence of science and all this kind of stuff. But it means something like, look, any kind of knowledge you approach with these presuppositions that are at root theological, even when they're anti-theological. That's a form of theological. And so our decisions around healthcare and other things are always shaped by bigger picture questions about what we think of the human person, and even in the final analysis, what we think about God and creation. So can you tell us, why is theology, as the title puts it, or what do you mean by saying theology is the queen of the medical humanities?
Well, if I'm honest, one of the main reasons was to be provocative, because I know that the journal that I was writing for, very secular journal, by the way, and it's to their credit that they're publishing, and they actually already have published the article in a symposium on the medical humanities. I wanted to be provocative, but I also wanted to make a very serious point, which is, well, as you suggest, the background for the point is this phrase, Queen of the Sciences, from the Middle Ages, which presumes, doesn't use science quite the way we think about it today, or many of us think about it, maybe most of us think about it today. I mean, science in that era had just a broader meaning, right? It sort of referred to any, systematic study of knowledge. Theology was queen of the sciences because it was theology that dealt with the ultimate questions and highest forms of knowledge that was responsible for organizing it all, right? So, and that's, we can talk more about that in the context of our conversation here, but I think it's deeply relevant, especially as one of the reasons for having a symposium on the medical humanities was to kind of take stock of the growth of the medical humanities in the last few decades, frankly. And among other things, what the growth of the medical humanities has done is it's made the point you made early on in the podcast, which is, hey, to do this, we really need a wide range of disciplines brought to bear on this. And so we need the humanities as part of our discussion of medicine and bioethics. And when we bring those in, we realize there are these other kinds of goods, these other kinds of discourses, including, morality and metaphysics and action theory, and that really impact how we think about, even again, what medicine is, what healthcare is, what health is. And since, we have a broad range of, systemic study of knowledge brought to bear with the medical humanities, if it's not just a total free for all, right? If it's not to be just whatever, but it actually has some organization in it, some first principles that guide it. I make the argument that theology needs to be queen of the medical humanities, not just in the abstract, though I do think it's in the abstract. But the article really focuses on what's happening to disability rights and the moral status and general status of the disabled more broadly in bioethics, which, as we go more and more to eugenics and physician-assisted killing and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis of embryos, all of these making judgments which are just anathema to any sort of understanding of disability rights, anti-ableism approaches. We can see that when this whole discourse becomes unmoored from the first principles that theology as queen of the medical humanities would offer, these vulnerable populations get simply discarded in a throwaway culture, a eugenic throwaway culture that makes these very judgments that if theology were queen of the sciences, we would stop dead in its tracks because we would have those first principles in place so that this would never happen, right? I guess I'll add one final thing here. One of the reasons the article title is so provocative is because not only is theology not the queen of the medical humanities, it's maybe as far away from that as it could possibly be, or maybe not. That's a little bit too dramatic. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, it was as far away as it could possibly be. There's a little bit on the upswing now, especially with Vanderweel writing his book. And I was just invited to go to ASBH, the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, to debate on physician-assisted suicide. And there are a few other things happening that are interesting too. But really, theology has lost its place at the table of bioethics and the medical humanities at all. Though again, that might be little green shoots to show that that's changing. But just to really finish the point here, theologians invented the discipline of bioethics. It was Catholic theologians that even started the very idea of this, and now it's very difficult for us to even get papers accepted at major bioethics conferences. We're certainly not known as a medical, one of the even, players at the table when it comes to medical humanities. So that's another way it's provocative too, is say not only should we have a seat at the table, but we should be queen of the whole thing. It's provocative, I admit.
Right. Well, I'm very tempted now to do 2 other podcasts instead of the one we had planned, because there's so much in there. I mean, one thing I'm thinking is I think there's a similar dynamic actually with the language social justice, which is very Catholic in its origins. I don't know that the actual term, I don't know the history of the actual term, but a lot of its early thinking is very Catholic in its origins. And now it's sort of, in a certain sense, taken on a life of its own, at least among certain political ideologies or whatever, which would be utterly divorced from a Catholic vision of the human person or society. So, I mean, that's an interesting dynamic. And then the other thing I was thinking, which I won't do a podcast on right now, but which struck me as really provocative, is what is thought of as progressive politically would seem to be in favor of the rights of the disabled and that sort of thing. But also ends up, endorsing things like assisted suicide, which runs completely counter to that. And then you have what is considered progress in the technological realm. And then you start thinking about designer embryos and all these sorts of things and the implications that has for how we think about the human person and ableist ideas. And it seems to me that there's a lot of threads that get tangled here. Like, what actually is progressive? And, that gets really messy really fast. And it seems to me that a Catholic theological approach, if I'm with you, let's make the bold claim, the queen of the sciences, would actually be immensely helpful in sorting some of those things out that under our current, let's call them cultural presuppositions, are like hopelessly hard to parse, because they're just fraught with internal contradictions.
Oh, I totally agree with that. It's reason number 11 billion to sort of drop this left versus right, progressive versus conservative, just totally unhelpful, unhealthy, sort of slouch towards what we count as a public discourse today. It's muddled, it's confused, it's focused on putting people in boxes and categories so they can be dismissed rather than engaging ideas. And I totally agree with what you just said, but it's just one of many examples. But what I find so interesting, and it's tough to make sense of if we use those categories, but what I found so interesting over the last several, years, couple decades now, is that out here on the East Coast where I live, I'm a Midwest boy, so in the United States, so I'm more a Regina type person than a Toronto type person, maybe is the way to put it. But I'm shocked by how resistant the so-called progressive states out here have been to physician-assisted suicide. And what's happened more often than not is it's been the disability rights groups who have come through and said the presuppositions you are going into with this legislation make us totally freaked out, because what we're essentially saying is we can understand if you have lost your autonomy, if you've lost enjoyable activities, the reasons people pick physician-assisted suicide, being a burden on others. We can sort of understand why you'd want to kill yourself. We want to make it legal for you to kill yourself. And the minute we make those kind of judgments, of course, those are eugenic judgments. Those are judgments based on ableist assumptions. And so deep blue progressive states like Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, until recently New York, and New York may even have the governor veto it, we're not sure, but New York until very recently, despite 10 years of trying, has rejected it. And some progressive states have passed it, but it's at least quite unlike abortion, actually. It's been a far more complicated and frankly interesting set of discussions we've had, at least in these states. And I know it's quite different in Canada. But I suspect it's because those judgments about ableism, what kind of lives are worth leading, how we want to protect those who are disabled, I know, in fact, I don't suspect, I know that those have been dispositive.
Very well. You and I could do another podcast on this, but I mean, maybe the point here is to see just from that little example how connected this discourse is to so many other questions, right? Health is related to questions about policy and politics and culture and the way we talk about each other, all the which is useful when we think about making every class Catholic, right? Because it's going to be drawing those lines. I want to circle back to this idea of the human person, right? So if one of the presuppositions we have that informs our discourse is like, what kind of a thing is a human person? In the Catholic world, we believe the human person is an ensouled body, right? We are physical creatures, but we're not only physical creatures. And so I want to think now, as we're moving towards like a Catholic health class in a high school, this vision of the human person as physical, but more than physical, as the ensouled body, how does that differ from maybe common conceptions of the human person that maybe some of our staff and many of our students are just bringing to the classroom without even considering that they're bringing a position? Like they might just consider it neutral, just the way things are. And then how does that show up how we talk about different kind of problems and questions in a Catholic health class?
Yeah, maybe we can go back to technology to help try to think about this. I am hypersensitive now, especially as these quantum computing ideas and AI and all the things that people have talked about for the last year or so, 2 years, so intensely, talked about them so intensely. It seems clear that many people have had something like a software plus hardware understanding of not only computers, obviously, but of themselves. And it comes from a reductionist view of the person, I think. And it comes from this idea. I was part of this group that was out in Silicon Valley recently talking to Catholic theologians, talking to the radical life extension people who, among other things, many of them think that they can upload themselves to a cloud someday, because they really do think of themselves as sort of software, right? Or information that's like software that can be uploaded. And the hardware is just this accidental thing, right? It could be a particular computer that you and I are looking at now, or it could be this other computer that we can upload ourselves to, and then download ourselves to maybe another computer in a robot someday, right? Or some other humanoid-looking contraption or whatever they imagine it might be. But that's just a totally impoverished idea of the human person. It's just totally objectively wrong. And it comes from an ancient mistake, right? An ancient mistake that early Christians were at real pains to try to call out as a mistake, just as it's a mistake today. It's a kind of Gnosticism, where the body is either evil or accidental to who one is, and the real self is this other thing other than the body, right? It might be a soul, or in the context of the our technocratic paradigm, again, the kind of software versus the hardware. The real important thing is the software, not the hardware. But we believe in to use the fancy word, a hylomorphic vision of the human person. Goes back to Aristotle through Thomas Aquinas and through the whole tradition, basically, where there's some other views out there, but the dominant tradition is one of hylomorphism, where the soul and the body are together in a way that it doesn't make any sense to talk about them as apart. The soul is the form of the body. You don't have a living human body without the soul, and maybe slightly more controversial, you don't have a human soul without having a living human body. Which is one reason why it's so important to pay attention to the Gospels, where Jesus is resurrected body and soul, and even still bears the wounds of his previous body. We talk about the resurrection of the body every Sunday at Mass. When we say the Creed, we believe in the resurrection of the body. But it's such a countervailing point of view in a culture that really thinks of it as really thinks of it's a new kind of Gnosticism. There's some people that are throwing around the phrase, I really like it, meat Lego Gnosticism, where the kind of stuff that we are, our bodies are really just meat Legos. And so it's not just that we can, upload ourselves to the cloud and one day have a different computer. It's that our sort of hardware now, which is this meat, is really a kind of Lego that we can move around and change based on how we really feel inside, our real self. This translates directly to discussions about sex and gender and the whole trans phenomenon pretty easily. But when we understand ourselves as hylomorphic bodies, ensouled bodies, a lot of these other mistakes that permeate these social issues, which are so hotly debated now, are put in stark relief and help us, I think through them very clearly and carefully.
I'm noticing a parallel that I wasn't expecting with the last question or conversation about the theology is the queen of the sciences, because what I'm seeing is utter confusion at the cultural level and inherent contradiction. And then if the Catholic vision is engaged, it offers some clarity. And let me just give an example. I mean, one of the things about Gnosticism is, on the one hand, it's like, well, the body is bad or accidental, and the real thing is, in the ancient view at least, spirit, right? Which needs to escape the body or all that kind of. But now you have a kind of Gnosticism that it is at least potentially materialist. Now that's weird, right? So
Yeah.
if you have, let's say you have these intense inner feelings that don't match your body. Well, where do we locate those? If there's no such thing as a soul, right? So on the one hand, you could say, well, my soul is one sex and my body is another, which is a confused idea of what soul and body even mean. Like, that's not even a theoretical possibility in terms of what if the soul is the form of the body. But it's one way you could try make this claim intelligible. But on the other hand, you try to locate it in genes, right? So you locate it in a physical thing that's just too small for us to see or sort of parse as a sort of theoretical construct. Of course, you can never actually find it in genes because it's not a physical idea, right? But that sort of serves a certain function, at least rhetorically, for how you talk about it, and it's sort of in a certain sense impossible to disprove. Like, it could always be in some other gene if you haven't found it in this one yet, right? But my point, without arguing all the details of the particulars, is there's not a clear picture of what kind of thing the human person is that you can use to make sense of these experiences. And I think, from a Catholic point of view, we can actually make sense of these experiences with better categories. We don't need to deny that the experiences that people, report are legitimate things. But I think the categories that our culture is trying to give people to think through what their experience means are inherently contradictory, impoverished. And if we actually had a good sense of a body soul composite, we'd actually have better ways of thinking about whether it's the gender problem, whether it's the, upload yourself to the cloud problem, any of these kinds of things, which seem to me fraught with internal contradiction, make a lot more sense if you think about a body and soul composite.
And that just shows, as you mentioned when in your opening to these sets of remarks here, is how important it is to bring in those foundational questions and how a vision of the good and of metaphysics and of moral status and of ensoulment and the relationships of bodies to souls is just absolutely essential for thinking about these questions, right? And we should not be embarrassed to invoke these questions. For so many years, even me, to a certain extent, I've been more bold, I think, than some others, but even me, sometimes I get a little bit, if I'm talking in a secular sense, should I really bring up a soul? Should I really talk about it? I think more than ever, it's not just talking to ourselves, though it's important to talk to ourselves as Christian and Catholic communities about these questions. We have a really dynamic opportunity here to try to step in, especially as in Europe and certain pockets of the United States. I'm not sure what it's like in Canada. There's some growing skepticism about these claims, these gender claims, these claims about technology and the techno-immortalists. But the culture is so cut off from these theological foundations and inheritance that it really doesn't quite know what to do. I'm deeply uneasy. This doesn't seem to make any sense to me. But this is, again, a reason why I think we ought to speak with confidence into our classrooms, into the broader public sphere on these questions, because we really have something important to offer here.
Right. Let me throw out, because it would be very useful to walk through each of these issues and see what a Catholic vision means for each of them. And we don't have time for all of them. But so let me throw out one. I'm a Catholic high school teacher. My kids are coming to me with AI stuff is going on. They're thinking about AI. And one of the things that happens, this is a fascinating thing, I think, and a scary thing, is, okay, a member of my family is dying, right? So what we're going to do actually is we're going to take all the data we have on them and feed it to an AI engine so that we can continue to have a conversation with them after they're gone, right? We'll in a certain sense, we'll upload them to a cloud. We'll put everything they wrote. We'll put a bunch of video of them, and AI is pretty capable at synthesizing all that and giving us the illusion of a person to engage with, right? Yeah. My students come in and say, well, yeah, now we're like, we're facing, grandpa's dying, but we're gonna upload him to the cloud, and we're still gonna have, grandpa there to interact with through an interface like ChatGPT. What do we offer when something like that? And I'm springing this one on you, No,
that's fine.
But I think thinking through this out loud, because this is the kind of thing that could happen in a health class in a Catholic school.
Yeah. You are springing on me, and that's okay. I guess I have two sets of reactions. The first is just about the act itself, and the second is about the implications of the act, broader implications. So first, with regard to the act itself, I think we need to be extremely careful in all situations related to the dying and death of our loved ones, that what we're doing is not so much about our own desires and what we want, that we lose sight of very important considerations, including the good of the individual and justice, what's owed to the individual we're talking about here, who's dying or dead. And we see this in other contexts in bioethics and healthcare. So oftentimes I get told that someone who's, has a catastrophic brain injury at the end of life is both, one of the reasons they don't matter anymore, with reference to an earlier discussion we had today. It doesn't matter because they're not having these experiences anymore that we just talked about, as some people think is a prerequisite for personhood. So, on the one hand, they say, oh, this individual is either not there or is, diminished sufficiently. We don't have to care about them the same way because they can't experience anything. And one of the reasons we need to take them off of life support or stop feeding them or whatever is because their lives are so burdensome, right? Which is a contradiction, right? If you're not having experiences, you can't experience your life as burdensome, of course. But what they're really saying often in that context and other contexts is it's a burden on me, or it's a burden on others, or it's a burden on the culture. And that's a reason why we need to move in the particular direction. And so I think we need to be very careful, about, in a similar way with regard to this, what is actually going on here? Are we doing this to honor the person, to do what's just for the person, or is this somehow something that's self-serving, right, in a very particular way? And again, I'm shooting from the hip here because I haven't had a lot of time, the chance to think about this. But I guess the second thing I would say is about the broader sense of what could happen here. And it gets into a broader question about how these AI bots are being used in other contexts. So you've probably all heard the stories about the AI girlfriend bots or boyfriend bots, where people fall in love with their AI chatbot and are just devastated when the company decides, hey, it's time to, you have to reload the program or something, and they've lost their whole interactions, over time, where they've built this relationship. They fool themselves into thinking that an AI chatbot is a person, right, that they can interact with. And that's a deeply dangerous presumption for two reasons. One, it's just false, right? It's not true that someone's there. But then in our attempt to fool ourselves into thinking that someone is there, the culture and individuals are subtly pushed to think of actually living people as just algorithms, right? Again, the kinds of things that could be uploaded to a cloud, and that our bodies are just kind of like hardware, and what we really are these algorithms, because I've convinced myself this AI algorithm is a person that I can interact with too. So you can see the kind of vicious feedback loop that this produces. So I think that's, this is a maybe less dramatic or less serious or less morally grave situation than the other ones, but it's still an example, isn't it, of pretending that someone is present when there's no one present there. And in fact, back to the justice question for the individual who's died or is dying, and I guess in this case died, pretending that algorithm is the person is not just, in my view, to the person who is existing somewhere else, right? They are not in this algorithm. They're not in your computer that's running the program. They have passed on to a different kind of life. And that's how we should be interacting with them, not in a way that pretends somehow that an algorithm is in fact a person.
Right. I mean, okay, my mind is going crazy with metaphors here. I mean, an algorithm at that point becomes something like a ghost, right? It's not the person, but it's like you're clinging to something about the person that should be somewhere else, right? And what does that mean for how? And I don't pretend the analogy is perfect, but but I'm thinking, if they're somewhere else, right? If they're in purgatory, and we should be praying for them, and what they're really undergoing is a process of perfection that makes them fit for heaven, and what in our imagination, at least, we're clinging to use the biblical language, right? Don't cling to me, right? Jesus says,
oh yeah, that's cool.
After the resurrection, it's this kind of clinging that, of course, doesn't actually restrict the person from being where they are and going where they're going, but restricts you from the relationship that you are in with that person in this time and place, right? Mm-hmm. The relationship that we as Catholics have with the deceased is a relationship of prayer for their overcoming of whatever imperfections were left with them at the end of this life, to be in better relationship with us, and finally perfect relationship with God. And there's a kind of clinginess to an algorithmic grandpa that really undermines our ability to participate well in their afterlife,
Exactly. I love that. I hadn't thought about that. I love the idea of not clinging, and that the idea of clinging again suggests this is about you, not about me, right? Like you're clinging onto me because of your needs, your desires. But there's something else about just letting death happen, right? And this is an important part of our culture too, is that it's a refusal to accept death as real. Like it's painful, obviously. It's sometimes terribly painful. But our refusal to accept the reality of death has resulted in some of what's being produced here in this idea that like we're inventing for ourselves a bogus anthropology just so we can imagine that we would never die, right?
Right.
And so that's just one of many harmful things that can come from just not accepting that people die.
Right. I read a book once, and it was just, I think it was an introductory chapter in the book. It was very insightful that said, it walked through history and showed how humans have, for hundreds or thousands of years, chosen metaphors for self-understanding from the most recent dominant technology, right? And so as AI chatbots become, the dominant technology, they become the sort of default setting for our thinking about ourselves. And what this book showed is that like all of these things change over time, which means that none of them were actually right. And what they were was metaphors. And metaphors can be very helpful. But metaphors get very dangerous when you forget that they're metaphors.
Yeah.
And so what we're facing, especially as the metaphors start to look and feel like us in really sort of interesting, troubling, fascinating ways, is the possibility of mistaking the metaphor for the real thing increases. And even before we got to AI, it was not uncommon to think of ourselves with metaphors from computers, hardware and software, whatever else, right? And to constantly remind ourselves that those are metaphors, and metaphors go so far and then they fail. And that when you reverse it and you say, actually, that's the real thing, and when the human person doesn't match onto the metaphor, it's the human that's wrong. And so what we actually need is, human life is just full of suffering. So why don't all of us just become chatbots and have assisted suicide? And then all the chatbots can live happily ever after without all the suffering. Like you can see how the logic would build itself out. If you think that a chatbot is really you and should share and relate with your family members when you're gone, and you're undergoing certain suffering, like you can see how the calculation works itself through, and it's based in a sense on like flipping the metaphor. So now that you're an inadequate chatbot instead of a chatbot being an inadequate human, right?
That's right. That's right. And again, this whole discussion presupposes what we were discussing from the start of this podcast interview, which is if you don't get these foundational questions of philosophy and theology right, you're just completely lost. And you're often lost in a way that makes the most money for shareholders or entrepreneurs who are trying to make money off these things, right? Which is what's driving so much of this is who's going to get rich based on it. But yeah, I really like this a lot. And of course, the young people that many people listening to this podcast want to serve have these questions just thrust on them in a way where they're given absolutely no ways to the kind of ways we were just discussing to make heads or tails of it, right? Which is why the kind of just general, sort of sense that many have, or just a sense of discomfort, or I didn't choose this, but I feel constrained by it. How can I make sense of that? How can we move in a different direction? That's another reason why Catholic education just should be absolutely forthright about speaking into these questions, especially so they give these young people what they need as tools to address it.
Right. Charlie, I get so excited when I hear you talk. My ideas start bubbling up in my head. I have a few more things just on my list that I'd love to talk to you about.
Sure.
One of which is, I think, really important in a health class, especially middle school, high school health, the relationship between physical, mental, and spiritual health, which of course is going to, in a Catholic context, grow out of our sense of the embodied soul, human person. But these things come together. We're seeing even statistically the correlations between physical health and other kinds of health, mental and spiritual health. How, as Catholics in a Catholic school, might we think about the relationship between those kinds of different, what we might call spheres of health?
Yeah, well, it just seems totally clear now that mental and physical and spiritual health are deeply, deeply intertwined. I don't even know secular people. I mean, they even talk about spiritual health. World Health Organization, I believe, uses mental and spiritual health as part of what it discusses with people when they think about the whole version of health and how they understand health. More and more doctors that I know of are asking for not only a kind of physical or healthcare autobiography, but a spiritual one as well, so they know how to address that part of the relationship. Back to my own particular context, it just seems so clear that my father's struggles and bad days are deeply connected to his mental health, and his good days are also connected to his mental health, almost even more so than what's going on with him physically. If I can just say, to my own horn a little bit here, maybe, I don't know if that's what I'm doing here, but the last few days that I've just been here to visit him, my mom has said he's a totally different person, right? He's like more energetic, he's more involved, he's just more engaged. He went for a chemotherapy infusion a few hours ago. I drove him to, and he was, had not quite a spring in his step, but it was just a kind of whole different way of being related to something like mental or spiritual or some, relational part of his life that wasn't there before. But you don't need to take my word for it. Almost anybody that's cared for somebody who's sick, especially dramatically sick, knows that this is part of the relationship. I mean, we have people who've died literally of broken hearts, right? I'm a big Star Wars nerd. I pay very close attention to the actors who played in the original movies, especially. And it was striking to me to hear the story of Carrie Fisher, who played Princess Leia, when she died. Her mom, I think, died the very next day, literally I think it's fair to say, a broken heart. I just find these examples, these real life examples, just so utterly fascinating. And there are these big debates even in bioethics, like how much should you tell a particular patient about their diagnosis if it's going to break their spirit, because they know so much about their spirit, their spiritual health will impact their ability to fight and to come back and to have a successful outcome or a more successful outcome. There are whole cultures, in fact, who have a totally different bioethics where they say you never tell the sick patient what their reality is. You tell their son, or you tell their wife, or you tell their caregiver, and then they are the ones that can sort of try to navigate these things. But we're embodied souls, and to the extent that we take that seriously, we will of course understand there's an unbreakable connection between physical, mental, and spiritual health.
One of the things I think we can do in a health class in Catholic middle school or high school is to get students to consider what habits they have that relate to both spiritual and physical, and add mental, right? Because all our health in any of those areas is related to our habits. And I think like exercise, and physical health has an analogy with like prayer and spiritual health. And totally. And I think it's worth helping students to reflect on how their practices impact their health. I think one of the things we do in our sort of medical, what kind of complex would this be? Capitalist medical complex, or you can make up any complex you want. And patients pressure doctors for this. Just give me the pill that will fix the thing. And the thing is actually, it's a lifestyle thing. It's an attitude. It's not only a lifestyle and an attitude thing, but very often there are lifestyle, attitude, even spiritual health questions that are just like quarantined off to the side so that we can treat it in this very narrow physicalist maybe manner that often just prolongs the issue, without getting to the roots of it. And I think if we start in middle school thinking about our habits, whether spiritual or physical, we're really well set up to structure, because habits form a life, and it seems to me that health is a great place to talk about this.
Absolutely. And our younger students know this better than we do in some ways, because they're the ones who, in the absence of somebody there to teach them how to form virtuous habits, are left to the kinds of habits that our culture coerces and structures them to habituate. So to when you're bored to pick up your smartphone and start scrolling, to think of yourself as the kind of projection you have on social media, to play video games and watch porn as just average aspects of what it means to be entertained. To think of, again, human beings as mere objects or things for us to use, rather than centers of the Holy Spirit, temples of the Holy Spirit, bearing the image and likeness of God. And so the question is not whether certain habits are going to be formed. Of course, we're habitual creatures. That's who we are. The question is, will we allow young people who intuit that they are having much of these things foisted upon them without much choice or autonomy or anything on their part, though they're told it's their choice, which makes it even worse, right? From their perspective, like they feel somewhat guilty from it, about it, as part of what's going on here. So it becomes even more important to say, hey, one of the reasons why your health is suffering, your mental health is suffering, your physical health is suffering, it's because of these habits. And you can have different habits, right? You can develop different habits, especially through the grace of God, through the importance of a lived experience within a community like a Catholic school. You can develop different kinds of habits, but it takes structures and systems and communities and prayer and the sacraments to really all come together to make that happen.
Right. One of the things that strikes me about what you just said is you give people agency, because I think a lot of our discourse around this stuff takes people's agency away. It just happened to you. There's nothing you can do, right? So we saw a video the other day. Procrastination is not your fault. It's a response to ADHD or whatever. Right. And my wife was like, "Well, it might be in a given case." But to say that in general, procrastination is simply a medical issue is to say to someone, you have no agency. Like you're just stuck procrastinating, and there's nothing you can do. Now, there are nuanced ways of handling this. And if it is part of a medical situation, there are ways of giving people agency even in those contexts. But I think the oversimplified, like YouTube versions of it very often just tell you like whatever you're experiencing just happens to you, and there's like nothing you can do about it, which is a really crippling sort of approach to the world, right?
Yeah. And in some sense, I would say it is true that something has happened to these kids, right? If you look at some of the surveys, for instance, they wish that they had not been handed a smartphone, right? That they weren't in a culture that makes it almost impossible for them to imagine not being on social media. So they're just sort of dropped into the situation where structures and systems have aligned in such a way that corporations and others just make tons of money off of their suffering based on these vicious habits they've formed. But it's just as important to say what you just said, which is it's not just you just sit there and waste away until you die of fentanyl when you're 52. You have agency. You have the capacity to break out of this. But it's not just about individuals pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps either. It's about communities like Catholic schools coming around students, embracing students, surrounding students with the kinds of love and loving structures and systems that can countervail this and offer quite a different set of habits to form.
Right. That's beautiful. The word that was in the background for me as you finished that was the word freedom, right? That freedom is not an assertion of yourself over against the world that you can do by some white knuckled willpower.
Yeah.
But it's the kind of thing that's embodied in a community that like their support actually gives you agency and freedom. We very often think of the church as like a place that gives rules, and therefore it somehow runs counter to freedom. And actually, even the rules part of it done well is part of growing your capacity for free action, good and free action, right? And the idea of a Catholic school community being a place for the cultivation of a free person in the face of whatever we talked about smartphones, but it could be any number of other things that are actually things that are running counter to our freedom, I think is a beautiful kind of image.
And
I
another
want
reason,
to.
why we should guard so jealously these Catholic schools as wonderful institutions. One of the things is I think about back to my own experience teaching Catholic high school. Um, I think it's fair to say by the time I had reached students at Fordham, so much of this had already been, I don't know if calcified is the right word, but the habits were already established that it was so difficult to even break into them, but especially towards the last few years I was teaching at Fordham. So the kinds of opportunities that administrators and teachers have to reach students at this stage is just totally priceless. It's just so important to hold on tight to.
Right, right. And health class seems such a central place. I mean, it's going to happen across the whole curriculum and the life of the school, but health class seems like a really important place to think about how this fits, right?
Absolutely.
And this goes to my next question, which is one of the difficulties in teaching health or many other subjects in a Catholic school is the resources, the curricular resources you're going to get are very often not Catholic, and they will have certain presuppositions in them about the human person, and it could be you could pick any number of things, mental health questions. One that comes up for me is the idea of safe sex, right? Whereas my son recently encountered something. It wasn't in health class; it was in psychology class, but there's an analogy here. And it was some statistics about kids choosing safe sex when they had closer relationships with their parents, and this is presented as straightforwardly good. And within a certain framework, it is straightforwardly good. If premarital sex is not a problem, then we want people to be more safe than not. And making more responsible decisions, and even things like delaying first sexual experience was all seen as good, which I can grant that. But with this lower horizon of what sex is for and the role it plays in a healthy human life and its relationship to the establishment of a family and all those kinds of things that we would want to say in a Catholic school, that was just not on the table, right? It was reduced to this like mutual pleasure giving, which is an aspect of sex, right? But it's this very low bar.
Yeah.
And if you're going to do it, do it safely. And kids who have these kinds of relationships with their parents, which we as Catholics would want, right? The open communication with parents are going to have these kinds of outcomes. And it was just like the presuppositions, you can see where they're going, but you can also say like, within that framework, you can see why it says what it says. But we want to introduce a better framework that would make sense of some of these, but also introduce some criticism or some critical thinking around it. And so I'm just wondering how we can think about engaging with the questions where some of the presuppositions, even in our resources, in the videos we're going to try show from YouTube, whatever else, are just going to have different presuppositions than we're bringing. How do we teach kids to challenge those, to do some critical thinking around the presuppositions that are coming at us?
Yeah, it's a ridiculously important question. I guess the first thing that comes to mind is to try to hold up a mirror to, well, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is there's no neutral ground on which to stand here. So let's just call out, what's the particular vision of the good that's being expressed when we say we have an attitude about sex where we just have safer sex. I think that's actually what more honest people are talking about is safer sex and delayed sexual years and those sorts of things. And to say this is not neutral. This comes from a particular vision of the good. Catholics also have a vision of the good. Ours is objectively correct. Theirs is not. But there's no neutral ground in which, like, we open up a health textbook and like there is the objective answer that everyone sort of agrees that science or like health sciences gives us or something like that. And that's the theme of the podcast so far. I think that comes out very clearly. The second thing I'd say is in trying to distinguish between the visions of the good, can we hold up a mirror to the culture, or to the student even, and say, how does this look to you, right? Well, what is this life like? Does it seem like a flourishing life? Does it seem like a beautiful life? Does it seem like an attractive life? And to a certain extent, it seems like, yes, a lot of celebrities do this. This is what's rewarded on your Instagram and Snapchat streams and whatnot. But on the other hand, it's if you can hold it up in the right way, it seems deeply, deeply ugly, right, and not attractive, and not at all a flourishing life. Especially if you look at the sort of spiral from a certain kind of social media presence to OnlyFans to porn. If you can see what happens to people who are caught in hookup culture, if you can see even to a certain extent, it might seem good from a Catholic perspective that fewer and fewer people are having sex. And it is to a certain extent, but if you think about the reasons why they're not having sex, it's not generally because young people are having less sex because they agree with the church's teaching on sex. It's because they seem so disinterested in it. They seem so focused on themselves, masturbation, porn, that whatever this might be, isolation, individualism more broadly, again, focus on AI and social media and scrolling your phones, that this also, if you hold up a mirror to it and you show it what it's like, it seems pretty awful and not at all attractive and not at all flourishing. You contrast that with what the objective data show about a married sex life. Is just objectively the case that married people have more and better sex than people who are not married, right? And so if you really want good sex, if you want a lot of good sex, you talk about getting married and having sex. That's just like what the objective data show. And the kind of life that comes from that, a kind of life of mutual self-gift, of a refusal to abandon your partner for any reason at all, right? Or virtually any reason at all, certainly under the context of marriage. A commitment to welcoming new life that may come from this sexual union, and welcoming children, and a kind of vitality and a plurality into the family that otherwise wouldn't be there. Incidentally, there's some data to show that the kind of sex that people have when they are open to procreation is also better sex than other kinds of sex that's more closed off. So if you can this is just one example, but it seems like if you can hold up a mirror and have honest conversations about what all this looks like. Oh, one other thing I forgot to mention, I just saw this yesterday. There's a growing trend. It's very difficult to talk about, but we should just talk about it because it's relevant to what we're discussing here. I don't know if it's an epidemic or some very high percentage. I don't have the article in front of me. Some very high percentage of young people today report requests to choke or be choked during sex, a kind of violent act, right? That comes almost directly from kind of deeply, deeply disordered practice that comes from porn and other similar kinds of places. Again, if we could just hold this vision up of or hold up this reality, a mirror, and say, here's what this vision of the good has produced, right? And we can offer a more beautiful, a more flourishing, a more attractive vision when it comes to these kinds of things.
That's great. I'm just thinking, I want to highlight for teachers as like and not even for teachers only. I'm thinking of actually my son Oscar could have used this to just ask the question, what is the vision of the good here? Yeah. Like if you're a teacher who's teaching, could be any subject, but health in particular, where something is presented as the scientific data on something like safer sex or whatever the particular question is. And you're like, something doesn't feel right here. And if we leave it as it stands, the student is going to experience a tension between what they think they're hearing from the church and what they think they're hearing from the science. And very few students left alone with that tension are going to be like, yeah, church, you know, like, the bias is going to be in a certain direction. And when it feels like, what are we going to do with this? To just start with that question, what is the vision of the good here? I think would really open up the possibility for a healthier engagement rather than leaving this like disintegrated sense of like, I'm hearing one thing here, I'm hearing another thing here, and I don't even know how these fit. And maybe the church is just telling me things because they're old and probably white and, you know, and men, right?
Yeah.
But even if you're a student, if Oscar could be reading this in psychology class and in the middle of the lecture say like, what's the vision of the good here? that's being proposed, that's a great question that a good teacher would engage, right? So I just want to highlight that for people as like a very practical, keep that question in your pocket. What is the vision of the good here? Charlie, you and I could talk for, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I got two more questions and I'm going to combine them into one question to wrap. But what I'm going to suggest is almost every question we did could have been its own episode. So I'm going to say to the viewers on YouTube, put the questions that either you thought wanted to be developed more, or follow-up questions that in your mind emerged from some of the conversation. Give us more questions. And I would love to do this again, because I feel like we've touched on things and then had to like not fully explore them because it was just sort of permutations branching out all over the place. So tell us in the comments what you would like to explore with Dr. Camosy, and I'd love to have you back to look at some of those, because there's just so much here. But let me go to the last one and circle back to where we started, actually, your work in Catholic social teaching and healthcare. And that's going to be the sort of entryway into a bigger question, which is something like, as soon as we start asking big picture questions about any subject, and health in particular, it's going to start bleeding over into social studies. How do we structure our communities? How do we think about how do we use resources? How do we talk to one another in our public discourse, right? All those kinds of questions kind of show up. And then Alex Brown is a member of our community. He shared a question that is along these lines. So I'll share the way Alex put it. He said, "Hey, Dr. Camosy, excited to hear from you again. I've seen a number of your talks. I think you bring a great perspective to this issue when we need it most. My question is, what are the principal ways that teachers can foster a better understanding of health for each student in their class, especially teachers who are not in the health department," right? I used to teach tech classes and Spanish. What are things I can focus on in other subjects that shape the way we think about the human person and is going to have implications for how we think about health?
Yeah, definitely have our own podcast about either of these two questions. I'll try to give an answer that incorporates both. Because Catholic social teaching and Catholic moral theology insist on such a broad range, queen of the sciences, queen of the medical humanities, such a broad range of influence and organizing principles when it comes to the first principles there. Virtually any teacher should be able to take some of what we've been discussing and find a way to incorporate it. Social studies seems pretty cut and dry, especially some of what we just talked about. We talked about structures and systems, social determinants of health. I find it so interesting that our current Holy Father, Leo XIV, has explicitly said he picked his name because he wants to build on and make reference to Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, and thinking about structures and systems when it comes to working conditions, living wages, limited work weeks, and all these things, all that were related to health in ways that are just so obvious. One of the reasons why health has improved is because we've chosen to incorporate a lot of what Rerum Novarum insisted on, and through public policies say we need certain kind of working conditions, we need certain kind of wages paid, we need limited hours, and if you get overtime, you get paid this amount. Children shouldn't work more than a certain amount. Certain children of a certain age shouldn't work at all, etc. And now we're at a different stage, right? Where with technology, if you're teaching technology, there are other structures and systems, some of which we've already mentioned, that are deeply connected to health. So, on the one hand, some of these technologies will improve health, but what they're really doing is what they'll really be good at or better at is fixing diseases, right? To think about what drugs would be better, how to target drugs to certain kind of cancers, how best to come up with certain kinds of surgeries that might be done better with robots powered by AI, something like that, maybe making complex diagnoses. But the real problem is related to health, especially as it intersects, as we talked about, with mental and spiritual health, are other kinds of questions that AI will not be able to help us with. AI will not be able to help us give more meaning in our lives. AI will not be able to give us back our work. In fact, one of the big concerns so many of us have about AI is it's going to take away the work that so many people find meaning in, and that so many human beings get a sense of their own flourishing in. And as we see, unemployed people tend to have lower health outcomes and worse health outcomes than the people who are in a flourishing vocation-filled life like that. And so, when it comes to Spanish, even it's been a while since I've been in a high school language class, but at least when we were in German, I think we studied German communities, right? And I imagine part of what people do in Spanish class is study Spanish speaking communities, and including especially in the United States. And one of the key things, especially if you're in the United States and other countries that have Spanish speaking communities, you can focus on is, what are these communities like when it comes to their health? What are the social determinants of health that affect health outcomes in these Spanish speaking communities, especially, but not only if they're immigrant communities? And how does a certain kind of racial justice or justice for immigrants, or a focus on just vulnerable populations in general when it comes to how they fit into, rich countries and prosperous countries, and how these worse health outcomes are almost always directly related to structures and systems that, social studies and other teachers would be very interested in. But anybody just focused on that seems to be, even in just a Spanish class, would be deeply relevant to focus on. So I could say more, but I'll stop there.
It's a great spur to the imagination. Yeah, it would be super cool, and maybe that's what people will ask for, is more examples. So feel free, if you want more examples, put that in the YouTube comments. But it's just helpful to see that connections that maybe we've almost been trained out of making connections. We've been trained to see the disciplines almost as silos, even though we talk a lot about interdisciplinary. But I'm not sure that our standard way of thinking about things lends itself to interdisciplinary thinking. It's good to just see the process happen. And I'll say, like, when I do workshops with teachers to like brainstorm ideas for like actual concrete specific lesson plans and unit plans, it's amazing how many of them end up being interdisciplinary, because the kinds of prompt questions I share are big picture questions, right? I don't go teach science teachers the mechanics of photosynthesis. They know that better than I do. I give them questions to zoom out and take a big picture view of what does it mean that the environment is so interdependent, and that humans relate to it in a certain way, and that, all those kinds of things. And as soon as they start asking those bigger questions, rather than just the mechanics of photosynthesis, all of a sudden they're thinking about poetry, and they're thinking about social justice, and they're thinking about all these, right? It wouldn't be a far line to draw from photosynthesis to some impacts for human health, right?
Absolutely.
And so just to even see you in very short scope start making the connections, I think can help us imagine how we might make those connections when we're doing lesson planning. So, Charlie, it's been almost an hour and a half, which is long for these. People can see I'm resisting temptation the whole time to go off on one rabbit trail or another, sometimes more successfully than other times. But it's always great to have you on a podcast. First time on this particular podcast, but I hope it's not the last. If people want to find out what you're doing, you mentioned you have a book coming out for high school ethics. Where can they find you? What kind of things can they look for?
So it'll be out in the fall with the Ave Maria publication curriculum for high school. So it'll be, I believe there's going to be a more traditional moral theology textbook, and then I wrote one that is more connected to a lot of the issues that we looked at today, that is focused more on practical ethics and practical issues. I do also have another more traditional book coming out in the fall called Living and Dying Well, a Catholic Plan for Resisting Physician-Assisted Killing, which is relevant to reasons that we've talked about already on this podcast, but obviously relevant in many states and Canada. But if you want to have a clearinghouse for some of this stuff, you go to my website, charlescamosy.com, or you can unfortunately follow me on the cesspool that is Twitter X. I'm way too active on that as well. At C Camosy, at CCAMOSY.
Excellent. Well, Charlie, again, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to chat with you, and thank you to all our listeners and viewers for tuning in again today. We'll see you in a month for another episode of Making Every Class Catholic podcast. God bless. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, I want to tell you about the Making Every Class Catholic online community. There you'll have access to regular live interactions with me and with plenty of great presenters and presentations, workshops, and Q&A, as well as to a network of committed Catholic educators and a growing library of resources. And be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and most important of all, share this with a fellow Catholic educator. We've got more exciting guests lined up in the months to come. You won't want to miss them. Until then, God bless you in your work, making every class Catholic.